I pretty much have to plan ahead or I will go crazy. I'm right now working multiple jobs. I do ministry with DR. I want to spend quality time with my fiance and my friends. And somewhere in there, I'm supposed to be planning a wedding. And some of that wedding planning has to be doing actual productive things and not just mindlessly clicking through Pinterest. And putting all of that into a schedule is necessary for me to make sure that happens in a reasonably orderly manner on a weekly basis. That said, it's really easy for that schedule to go from streamlined and helpful to bloated and overwhelming. I've very often found myself to be chronically overscheduled, completely drained, or doing a lot of stuff without any real focus or purpose behind it. I know that I'm busy, but I don't always know where all of that time is going. And I don't think that's actually a unique problem. Many of us are too busy, but that busyness is not always spent where it counts. The most important things can get tossed in favor of what feels urgent right now, and our schedules end up controlling us instead of helping us. And when we're so busy, what is it we're missing? Maybe you know that you should start eating better and exercising, but we're just too tired after work or class to cook or go to the gym. Or maybe we know that our friend is going through a really tough time right now, but we don't have the space or energy to really be there for them. Keeping up friendships and relationships, it takes a lot of time and energy, and that doesn't always make it into our weeks. Maybe there's that project or that goal that you've been meaning to start on, but there's just not room in the calendar for it yet. And when we're too busy just trying to get a bunch of stuff done, there's a lot of not yet. And maybe we're in a season where we're not actually that busy. We have lots of time, but there's not a lot of focus or direction. How are we using the time here that God's given us? If we want to simplify our lives and live with the fullness that God offers us, we have to start with how we're spending our lives in the first place. And God cares very much how we spend our time, as how we spend our limited time here will define the type of person we turn out to be. Throughout the Bible, we see the idea that how we use the time we are given is important. We see it very prominently in Proverbs, which is all about living wisely. Look straight ahead and fix your eyes on what lies before you. Mark out a straight path for your feet and stay on the safe path. The way of the godly leads to life, and that path does not lead to death. These verses aren't just telling us about the danger of double booking ourselves. They're about the huge importance of how we spend our lives and that we need a plan, something to follow that leads us into the full life that God offers us. And Paul adds something really interesting to this in Ephesians. So be careful how you live. Don't live like fools, but like those who are wise. Make the most of every opportunity in these evil days. Here we're told to be careful, to be wise, and also to make the most of every opportunity. And these things can feel a little contradictory. So stay in the lines and don't slip up, but also seize the day. And this idea might seem odd because we don't always look at planning ahead and scheduling as a way to open us up to more. Budgeting our time feels like it will be restricting, keeping us from doing all of the things that we want to do. But the reality is, putting together a good schedule can help us free our time and put it to use in ways that grow us, change us, and equip others to do the same. God cares very, very much about the people that we are becoming. And if how we spend our time helps shape who we're becoming, then God definitely cares about where our time is going. And this idea is so important that in his book, Simplify, Bill Hybels argues that setting a God-first schedule is one of the holiest things we can do. It's holy because how we spend our time reflects our relationship with God and shapes who we're becoming. But what is a God-first schedule? To think about this idea more clearly, I want to still kind of envision how you usually go about making a schedule. I'm guessing that first you start in by plugging in your classes or your work hours, maybe some meetings or study group, any other weekly obligations. And then if you have time after all that, there's maybe a fun thing or two in there. And even if you don't write out your schedule or explicitly plan it, you still make plans. You still make decisions with how you use your time. You choose one activity over another, and you commit to school, work, or other obligations that fill up your time. But what if, instead of just plugging in what we thought were the obvious things, or letting our time just fill up with whatever comes our way, what if we started our schedule making by asking this? How would God have us spend our time? What might that look like? What kind of people would he want us to become in the next few months, the next year, or the next decade? What relationships is he calling us to begin, to nourish, or to repair? What areas of our lives is he calling us to pay greater attention to and to start growing fruitfully in? And how might God want us to spend our time so that our lives are more rooted in him? Someone in the Bible that I think really had a God-first schedule is Daniel. If you're unfamiliar with Daniel's story, it begins when the kingdom of Judah is conquered by Babylon and its people are carried off into exile. Babylon already had its own gods, and so they were not particularly interested in the one true God of Daniel and the other exiles. What they were very interested in is using the best and brightest of these exiles to better their own nation. And so Daniel and a few other young men were selected to join a special training program and enter the king's service that we read about in Daniel 1. Select only strong, healthy, good-looking young men, he said. Make sure they are well-versed in every branch of learning, are gifted with knowledge and good judgment, and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon. The king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens, and they were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. All of these things were intended to change Daniel and the other exiles chosen, to integrate them into Babylonian culture, and to change their ideals to be more like Babylonians. And in the face of a culture that very much wanted him to turn away from God, Daniel would have to make conscious choices to orient his life around God and his plans in order to remain set apart. In the very first chapter of Daniel's story, we read about his food choices. When given those rich foods and wines, Daniel requested that instead he be given vegetables and water. And this might seem like a pretty trivial thing, but it was an intentional choice Daniel made to keep his life centered on God and not be sucked into the opulent and materialistic culture around him. These kinds of choices in Daniel's life were critical to keeping his identity rooted in God, even while in exile. And later in his story, we see a very specific way that Daniel spent his time. He prayed consistently every day. Even in the face of a law that would punish anyone who did not specifically worship the Babylonian emperor, Daniel kept this key part of his schedule. But when Daniel learned that the law had been signed, he went home and knelt down as usual in his upstairs room, with its windows open towards Jerusalem. He prayed 3 times a day, just as he had always done, giving thanks to God. I really like the addition of just as he had always done here. Even a law threatening death to anyone found worshiping something other than the emperor was not enough to throw Daniel off of his time with God. This time to center himself in God's love and provision was just that important to him, and he spent his day in such a way that he could make that time with God a priority. Daniel's focus and clarity about who God made him to be and how God wanted him to spend his time meant that he could follow through on a God-first lifestyle with confidence and conviction, even in the face of treachery and lions. And hopefully we are not facing treachery, lions, or some combination of those two things. But figuring out our own schedules so as to become the kind of people God wants us to be is still really important for us today. So, how do we go about making our own God-first schedules? First, while all of our time, gifts, and energy come from God, it is our responsibility to steward those things well. In other words, we are the bosses of our own schedules. Busyness, packed calendars, and burnout are not things that just happen to us. They come as a product of the choices that we make in our schedules. This idea of being responsible for stewarding our schedules well is not meant to guilt anyone, but rather to help remind us that we have the ability to use our schedules in a way that help us to become who God wants us to be and not just be controlled by our calendars. Next, rather than just starting with our work schedules and obligations, start with what kind of person you want to be and what areas will help you to grow in those ways. And simplify. Before he even brings up schedules, Bill Hybels talks about the areas that give his life energy and help define the specific activities of his daily life. For him, those areas are connecting with God, marriage and family, satisfying work, recreation, and exercise. Now, those are the areas that work really well for Bill Hybels, and unless we're all about to be very surprised, none of us in here is Bill Hybels. The areas that help shape his schedule will not necessarily work for you, nor should they. I do think, though, that they provide a really good basis when helping figure out what replenishes you and what are the big areas that should go into your own God-first schedule. First, I think that connecting with God should definitely be a part of a God-first schedule. And this won't look the same for everyone. It might be that you're still exploring a relationship with God, or it might be that you're trying to deepen your relationship with him through spiritual practice. Wherever you find yourself in your walk with God, your time with him should be a consistent part of your schedule. That time reaching out to him, listening to God's voice, and resting in his love will be your biggest replenisher, and ultimately it will help guide the rest of your agenda. When we're rooted in God, we are much less likely to be swayed or overwhelmed by the expectations and opinions of other people or the culture around us. Ultimately, our identities come from God's love for each of us. So what could be a better use of our time in becoming who God made us to be than spending time with him? Second, I think it's really important that some of your time is relational. For each of us, there are people that are really important to us, and those relationships need time and space to grow and thrive. If you're more extroverted, this time is critical for your energy. And even if you're not and you're more introverted, having deep relationships is still important for your mental and emotional well-being. For me, there's a few different people that I try to prioritize time with each week. With my fiance, Tyler, much of our quality time consists of either getting coffee or having dinner together and then watching copious amounts of Parks and Rec. Thanks. I also make time each week for meeting with a small group of other women to catch up on life, help keep each other accountable in our goals, and occasionally to go on adventures through Target together. Mentoring relationships are also really important to me. And so I meet with my own mentor, and in turn, I mentor two other young women in DR. Finally, while this time can't always be as consistent each week, I try to spend quality time with my friends from high school and college, occasionally just by playing copious amounts of Pokemon Go around Reed Park. The space for relationships could also be you investing in a relationship with someone who doesn't yet know Jesus, being someone that they know cares for them and someone who's safe to ask important questions. God might even be leading you to invest in a relationship with a brand new person from your work or your classes. And whatever relationships you have, whether they're old or brand new, make nurturing them a priority in your week. Some of your other areas should also include purpose and using your gifts in service of others. This can be in your work, in your classes, or in serving others through volunteering. I do think in this area, it's very important that you balance this with the other areas and set healthy boundaries around it, as work in particular is a very tempting area to overdo in our very productivity-focused culture. That said, the ability to use your gifts and work towards your purpose in God's kingdom can be incredibly satisfying, and it gives us an opportunity to serve and glorify God in really unique and creative ways. Finally, your other areas should encompass rest and recreation. While this might not seem directly important to the type of person you want to become, prioritizing these areas in your daily rhythm will help you to recharge and replenish and allow you to bring your best to your work, your relationships, and to your time with God. Consider what activities fill you up. Maybe it's being alone with a good book, playing board games with friends, making art, or just spending time outside in nature. Taking a weekly Sabbath, a day specifically for rest, can be transformational not only in the amount of energy you have, but in your relationship with God as we learn to stop and to trust that he can keep things going on without us. For some of us, prioritizing rest and fun can feel very unnatural or frivolous, but putting intentionality and thought into your rest activities will help them to be a source of energy for you, a source of energy and refreshment for you that is critical to living a life that's full and marked by joy rather than feeling drained and overburdened. And when you're considering what your big life areas are that are specific to you, I encourage you to consider the example that Jesus gave us in his own life. In his schedule, there was a healthy balance between each of the big areas. His focus wasn't just efficiency. He could have just taught and ministered to big crowds like nonstop for 3 years and covered tons of ground with his ministry. But that wasn't the point. Even when those crowds wanted more and more of Jesus' time, he intentionally stepped away, taking time from the outwardly focused aspect of his ministry to just teach his own disciples or to take care of himself and his relationship with God. In Luke, we read about finding this balance after Jesus instructs a man he had healed from leprosy to not tell anyone what had happened. But despite Jesus' instructions, the report of his power spread even faster, and vast crowds came to hear him preach and to be healed of their diseases. But Jesus often withdrew to the wilderness for prayer. His focus was not just getting things done or fulfilling others' expectations. and his rhythm showed that. And much like with Daniel, Jesus' consistent time with God was foundational to his life and ministry. With his focus and identity firmly rooted in his Father's love, Jesus' life wasn't hurried, overwhelmed, or without focus. And whatever he did have in his schedule, he showed up and he was truly present in every one of those moments. Once you've figured out what your big areas are, think more about the person you want to become. Do one of those areas start to jump out to you as needing more work in order to get you towards the person you want to be? If we simply continue to do the same thing, nothing will change. To be different, we're going to have to act differently. And that rarely happens if we don't have a plan to do that. For example, if you want to be a great friend, parent, mentor, significant other, or any other half of a relationship, you actually have to be present for said relationships. Do you need to start maybe blocking in quality time with those people? Are you maybe struggling in your classes or just struggling to find any sort of joy or purpose in your major? Then maybe you need to schedule a meeting with your advisor, find a time with a tutor, or just choose a more effective time to study. Do you want to get your finances in order? Then schedule a time to make a budget, find a financial peace course, or look into apps that can help you track your spending. Creating a weekly time to review your budget and plan ahead can make a huge difference in your financial life and your ability to have a non-stressful relationship with money. Maybe you want to become more outwardly focused through service. Seek out some potential ways to serve with refugees, with homeless youth, in church, or any other number of areas that could use your energy and gifting. And once you have that service area, plug that into your calendar and begin to see how your time can tangibly serve others, even if it's only a little bit each week. And using those big areas and those ways in which you want to grow, you can start to draft your own God-first schedule. If you're not someone who normally writes down their schedule, I encourage you to do so when trying to do this. Also, be willing to be honest with yourself and flexible in that process. You're most likely going to need to make edits to that schedule, and you might even need to redo it a couple of times. Getting feedback from a trusted friend or a mentor can also be really helpful here. And I think it's also important to remember that the schedule will change. Like if you're a student, your schedule will pretty much change every semester until you graduate. Even if you're not in school right now, work obligations, family needs, or any number of other variables can mean that the ways how you balance your time can change. So you don't need to sit and redo your schedule every week, but when you see an upcoming change in the season of your life, it's probably a good time to sit down and start to figure out that balance again. The great thing about figuring out these big areas, though, is it means you don't have to start from scratch every time. Once you know the broad strokes of what makes up your specific rhythm, you can start to plan your schedule more fruitfully. And once you've made that schedule, stick to it and show up. Whatever priorities you set, be present in them and bring your best so that you can glorify God. This is where it's so important to really think through what these areas are and be investing your time in what matters the most, because then it's that much more exciting to bring your best to it. And even if growing in an area requires you to do some stuff that you're not super jazzed about, knowing that this is a place where we're working towards being who God made us to be can help us to put forth our best effort. And so if your God-first schedule has a focus on actually spending more time with God, then show up to that. Find a place where you can minimize distractions, have a plan for your time, and learn to practice silence and solitude and learning to really be with God. If your focus is on becoming healthier and losing weight, then show up to that. If you sense the distance growing between you and a friend and you want to deepen that relationship, then show up to that. If God is calling you to work through a fear or an anxiety that has been weighing you down and cluttering your soul, then show up to that. And when we show up, God meets us there. When we show up in our work, in our classes, in our recreation, in our relationships, and in our time with Him, we are in a position to see God at work in ourselves and in others in really exciting ways. Even when we're really struggling, showing up means that we offer a space for God to move in our lives. Of course, God can work in our lives even if we're feeling pretty far from Him. But there's something really beautiful about actually seeking God in our daily and weekly and yearly rhythm in whatever it is we do. So, where can you start? Whether you are a super detailed planner or you're brand new to making a schedule, I want to challenge you to start by considering those big areas of your life that help drive you. While those areas will look a little bit different for everyone, make sure that connecting with God is one of those areas and that relationships, rest, and recreation are not neglected. Think about what kind of person you want to become, whether in the next few months or the next few years, and pray. Ask God to show you which of those areas need more effort and attention in this season, or what has become a barrier into living your life with him well. Ask a mentor or a trustworthy friend to help you see how to move forward and help you plan for that as you make the schedule. And once you've drafted it and you've edited, show up. Whatever you schedule, show up to it and bring and glorify God in that activity. I do think that sometimes that last step, the actual showing up part of living out our schedules, can be the toughest for us. We can have a super clear vision of who we want to be and still fall flat if we don't actually follow through on it. And this doesn't mean that we have to hit every note in our schedule perfectly or never be tired or never be out of it. The last thing I want everyone to walk away from is that making a schedule should turn you into a perfectly put together robot with no room for error. God is incredibly gracious with us, and it's important that we have that kind of grace for ourselves as well as we work towards being more like Jesus every day. When we rely on him and we seek out how he would have us arrange our time, we put ourselves in position to see how God can work in our lives. And ultimately, schedules are a tool. They help us harness our limited time here to help us become the people God is calling us to be. And while making those intentional choices every day, and finding that balance that God desires for us can be difficult, there is nothing more worth showing up to. So when I read about Blue's Big Week as a kid, I mostly learned that I could fit both cookie making and cleaning my room into my weekly schedule. And while I still do both of those things, maybe making cookies just a little bit more, I know now that my schedule can be for so much more than that. It can help us to become who God is calling us to be. And that's a pretty incredible thing. But to become that person, to become more like Jesus in my character and my actions, there has to be planning and intentionality. I'm not going to get there by accident, and neither will you. Without the holy activity of arranging our lives as God would have us spend them, we'll continue to just be. And God has so much more for us than that. The Bible tells us that God has begun a good work in us and that he will faithfully continue it until Jesus returns. We can plan and we can work towards that change, and God meets us there with grace and magnifies our efforts in a way that we could never accomplish on our own. When we show up, becoming this person is easier because God is waiting for us, ready to help us become who he made us to be. And in the end, that's really what schedules and the lives they help us live are actually about. Please pray with me. God, I thank you for the opportunity you give us in stewarding our time and our gifts well. I thank you for the trust and that heavy responsibility you place on us, and for the wisdom that you give us in doing that, Lord. I pray that we go out from this and consider our schedules, consider those areas, Lord, that we learn to make our time with you and our time with others just as much of a priority as our work and our classes, God. And I pray that you help us to move forward and make changes in those areas well. I thank you for your guidance and your provision in this, Lord. We love you in your son's name. Amen.